Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Rawkode Live. I am your host, Rawkode. Before we begin, I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you to Equinix Metal. They are my employer. They are a bare metal cloud, and they give me the time and resources to invest in this show and produce content that we can all learn from together. If you want to check out Equinix Metal, please use this Rawkode-Live coupon. This will get you $50 of compute. That is roughly 100 hours on our smallest instance. Certainly enough for you to have some fun and play with. Now, today, I am joined by my friend, Kieran McNulty. Welcome back, Kieran. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Hi, David.
So, I can hear you, although your video is frozen on you. Although I think it's coming back. So, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
I can. I'm just going to prioritize my laptop, my network. Hang
on. Someone got Netflix on.
Yeah.
All right, I'll give it a little bit of context just now while you get that sorted. This is it's turning into a bit of a series. We're taking a look at behavior-driven development through multiple episodes and real-world application. I have been building out, or failing to build out, but being guided by Kieran, a Git library called GitSync, written in Rust, that aims to provide the backbone of GitOps-style operators or event-driven applications. We kind of started by an example mapping session, which was roughly 2 weeks ago now. We used a Miro board, and in real time, we kind of tried to discuss the application, just flesh out those requirements, loads of stickies that had colors, very nice guidance from Kieran on how that all works. And then we looked very briefly at, well, how do we store this in a Git repository? How do we use Gherkin to write scenarios and kind of give other people, not just my own understanding of the application, but share that with other people? And I think we wrote half a scenario, and then you told me to go away and do my homework and do more, and I didn't. And then we thought, well, why don't we just continue the series? Let's do this live. It's always a pleasure to have your guidance, because I really do. I'm really terrible at this. So
No. Yeah, so the thing we did last time is broadly speaking in this sort of area of discovery, deliberate discovery. So we sort of took time to, I didn't know anything and you knew a lot, and then maybe we added a bit during that conversation. And I think if we'd had more people, we'd have had more sort of insightful questions that helped us flesh it out a bit. And we came out of that with a kind of shared understanding of what it should do, what we've decided that it should do.
Yep.
Because we don't want to make it too like specky, too contracty. But we'd have done that quite soon before we're going to build it, and we came out all understanding what we'd just agreed. And I think what we might find is, because it's been 2 weeks, we'll have kind of forgotten the context. So I guess we're going to look at the Miro board. We might not quite remember what some of it means, because it's kind of scrappy notes. So the ideal is that shortly after that, someone would capture that conversation, and that's where the kind of second step of sort of formulation comes in, where you don't want to slow the meeting down by capturing everything in the meeting. If you've ever tried to do that in a meeting, it's absolutely painful. Everyone stop talking while I type this. So you try and avoid that, but then you try and sort of dump it out shortly after. And then share it with everyone and make sure you captured it right and maybe get some feedback. So that there's a few cycles inside that process before, and then you take that through to development. That's the kind of gist. So I guess we're at that step of, we're going to try and capture what we talked about last time, write it down in a way that we think is going to be clear. I remember one of the reasons you're doing this is to have documentation for people in the future.
Yep.
So capture it in a way where it's going to be clear for those sort of future generations.
Definitely. I don't want people to run this and have any surprises about what is actually happening. So I guess we'll get up the Miro board. Let's run through that briefly, and then we'll start putting our scenarios together. We have our first comment as well from someone I think we both know, Mark. Hey, Mark, how's it going? All right, let's pop this up. Let's see. Zoom in a little bit.
So to recap briefly what the structure is, we've got the blue things are the most important things. They're business rule. They're things that have to be implemented somewhere in the system. So it's really important we understand what they are. They do directly map to the code you're writing in a way.
Yeah.
They're the build. They're like what it's.
Oop, I lost you, mate. And he's gone.
I'm still here.
All right. Yeah, you froze on me for a second there.
Oh dear. Yeah. So the yellow things, and when you're doing example map, you sort of think of it as this rule.
I'm not. No, you're in and out, Kieran. Your video has given up, and your audio is.
Can you hear me at all?
Yep. I'm just going to check my connection just in case. So, Mark, since you're in the comments, if you let me know if it's just one of us or both of us. No, my connection looks pretty solid. I've got 500 meg. All right. You've not frozen on me in the last 30 seconds, so we'll continue.
What I might do is disconnect briefly and come back. Is that going to break anything?
No, you do that. I'll tell jokes. Yeah, thanks for the comments, Mark and Wolfgang. I think it is just Kieran's connection. I'm not sure if there are too many Netflix sessions going on, or he just needs. Maybe it's the new M1 Mac. Maybe the networking is not very good in it. Although we'll see. So this Miro board then. Oh, it's back already. Let's see if that's any better. So the Miro board, the blue stickies
are rules.
Good save, thanks. Our rules, and then the green cards were examples of things that we think happen within those rules. The yellow, I don't remember what that was, and the red was questions.
Yeah. So the important, I don't know how much you caught before I broke up. So the important thing is the business rules. They're going to be implemented in the code. So all of this is so everyone understands the business rules in a way. The yellow thing is called a feature in this context, but it's really just a way of grouping the rules together into something that we're going to deliver as a block. So you could think of it as like which rules need to go together for it to be worth releasing it or saying or counting it as done, So they might be the things that you have in your backlog if you're doing a sort of backlog-driven development. You might think this first rule, repositories are cloned if not already. We wouldn't want that if we hadn't implemented the other rules as well. So the rules become a nice way to chunk down your work. Mike Cohn has some acronyms, SPIDER, without an E, of different ways of breaking down he says user stories because it's Mike Cohn, breaking down user stories into smaller ones, and the R is rules. So are there some of the business rules we can implement first without the rest is a nice way of doing it.
Okay.
The others are other stuff. Spike, path, identity, and data. But like one of the strategies for chunking stuff down is to break it up by rules. So it's nice if you can say, actually, we could do these first. And actually, maybe some of the rules could be, this is going a bit deep, the rules can maybe relate to feature toggles. So say maybe the rules could be feature toggled. But anyway, so
yeah.
To say that we've done initial cloning of the repo and tick it as done on our list of to-do, those 3 business rules are going to be implemented. And the way we know they're implemented is for each rule, we came up with an example, at least one example. And in the third case, we had 3 different examples of ways it might work.
Yep.
So the examples are there so that as a developer, I can sort of say, I can read the example and it gives me a better understanding of the business rule. But also, we on the third one, we need these 3 different cases to all be true. And naturally, that'll help us test it later. So it helps us understand the rule and it helps us test the rule. But they're only really there for the rule, to make sure the rule gets implemented. The end game is the rule is implemented by the software.
Okay, that makes sense. So we identified 3 features. Is there a semantic or heuristic that says that this is one feature file or one scenario or multiple scenarios? Like, how do we then translate this to the Gherkin language then?
I'd put it in one feature file per feature.
Perfect, sure.
Initially. But if it's sort of, so sometimes later in a project you're working on something that's more like modifying the existing rules, you might instead edit an existing feature file. If that makes sense.
So like the first step for us would be then to work on our initial clone feature and then try to take these rules and examples and flesh them out as full scenarios that we can then use for documentation and for testing.
And if you're doing this first, and for deciding what order you're going to do things in, so to guide your own workflow. So if I'm working on this project, I would think, which feature am I going to work on next? Maybe it's this one. As I'm working through it, maybe I'll think, well, okay, my first thing I need to do is I need to implement repositories are cloned if not already. And I'd get that going, do that sort of test-driven thing. Yep. But let's write the feature. We'll write a feature file and then see how it goes.
All right. So
there's this thing about writing tests first. It's popular with the kids.
And not with me. I've never been very good at that. But I will try to fix my bad habits. So
one of the points of BDD, so TDD exists, and people tend to apply TDD at a low level when they're trying to work out an algorithm or something. One of the reasons for BDD is to sort of encourage applying that pattern at higher levels. This higher level is of a feature, so let's design the feature first in an automatable way, and then we'll write the code, which is kind of TDD, but it's just sort of phrasing it differently to make it more likely that people do it. And this is what we wrote last time, right?
It is, yes.
So we slightly reword. This is a good example. We slightly reworded some things from the example map, and that's perfectly fine. If you're in the session and you think of a better name, it's fine to editorialize a bit. It's kind of what you're meant to be doing, is clarifying. And then you would share this with, well, you're sharing it with me now live. But you might do this writing down outside of your repository. You might do it in, it's good to match the communication methods that people are happy with. So it could be a Google Doc, could be in a field some field on a Jira ticket.
Yep.
It could be you paste it into Slack and say, what do you guys think? You sort of do it informally because you're expecting people to say in some places, that's not really what we talked about, or tweak it a bit. But let's do it in the Git repo. So you've got the feature title, you've got a bit of explanatory text that is just for readers, it's not for the computer.
Yep.
We've identified a rule. We've got one example. So what's the rule? If the directory doesn't exist, the repository can be cloned. So given I've got no local directory, when I sync a Git repository, then the Git repository is cloned. What do you think of that one?
I'm not sure because I don't even remember who wrote that, if it was you or me or collaboration. To me, it makes sense. I mean, one of the things I struggle with when it comes to writing scenarios is trying to understand the subject. Like, I think because, I know there's like, I don't know if they're rules or guidelines, but avoid in terms of user and such.
Yeah.
And here we're using I mean, is that fine?
You can switch it.
Yeah,
it's fine. You could switch it to the passive voice if you want to.
Okay.
Given there is no local directory when the Git repository is synced.
Yeah. So I mean, just trying
There's two stylistic things. One is being I-centric, which some people really like. Saying, you can also do a sort of third-person thing where you say, when Bob syncs his Git repository. And that's useful if you've got some concept of, different user personas or maybe different types of users, like you're trying to cater for people who are really familiar with the system, but also you want to think about, James, who is not tech savvy at all and has different challenges, or people who are really familiar with it. So if you've done that kind of user scenario thing that usability people like to do sometimes, returning users, new users, you could have names and, flesh all that out. Some people do I because, again, it makes it feel a bit more immediate. Whereas the passive voice
about a plural, like given we have no local directory when we sync?
Yeah, I mean, sure. There isn't a right or wrong there. What I would try and do is match how were people talking about it in the session. So the people in the session, were they saying, when I go here, I should be able to do this? Or were they saying, when the customers come to our site? I try and match that. It's probably the best.
Okay, let's stick with I for this afternoon's session. We also have a quick question from Wolfgang, who is asking, rules and examples, aren't they the same?
Yeah. So this can happen when you've only got one example. And there's two types. One of the hard things when you're writing a scenario is how much detail do I need to put in there. So using rules is quite important for this, to help this. It's one of the reasons rules have been adopted quite a lot. Is one reason for adding specifics into a scenario is going to be because it's relevant to the rule. So what's the rule about? It's about directories and what a directory existing or not means. Mm-hmm. So any detail that's about that can lead to some questions, right? So what does directory existing mean? What happens if it sometimes leads to questions? What happens if it exists but is owned by someone else? What happens if it exists with a different case? What happens?
Yeah, we never really get into a lot of that.
What happens if it's hidden for me because of my user permissions, but I can't create a directory with that name because there is one in the file system. All of these might be technical things. But so one reason is to explain the rule. I think we could put the name of the directory in there to make it clearer, to make it more like an example.
Okay, so would that be part of the...
Given I have no directory called something, when I sync the Git... Yeah, so actually that's a good question. In Git, what determines the name of the... In your system, is it always going to use the name of the repository as the folder name?
Not quite. Did we touch about that on the config? No, I don't think we did. I think we spoke about it last time, but what we said was there is the concept of configuring Git sync to tell it, where the cache directory is going to be to store these repositories and stuff like that. But what I said was that functionality, I don't mind being just hard-coded as sensible defaults for now and bringing configuration later. So we haven't really said it's going to clone to this. But yeah, I think realistically it's going to be the name of the project. Okay, so let's give an example of a project name that makes it. So one reason is to make it explain the rule better. The other reason for extra detail is to make someone reading it understand the domain we're operating in a bit more. Is project very good okay? Or yeah, you want it to be. You don't want to be too silly. Like if you make it too abstract, if everything's foo and bar, it's harder to read and it's less real to people. They don't think about their real projects. But project A's fine. Yeah. Repository ABC, I think, makes more sense than project because we're dealing with Git here, not something else. Yeah, and then so that's the context. The action is when I sync a Git repository, you could either say what's the name of the Git repository, or you could say a Git repository that would be cloned into repo ABC. If you want to sort of defer that those config rules for somewhere else. like something like that.
Yeah, if you're happy for that, that's fine.
Or should that be should I just use a real repository rather than?
Yeah, why not?
Like, I guess
it makes it realer, doesn't it?
It can clone itself. So actually, let's just do that.
That's an organization.
Git sync. So when I clone the git sync repository, we actually just clone ourselves as part of the test case.
Into git sync, I would put. So I try and have the steps at a similar level of abstraction, or I would say
this is git sync doing the sync, right? I mean, sync is.
Yeah, then the repository is cloned, and I would say either I would say into git sync, or I would say that directory. Just depending on whether there's too much repetition.
Let's do that.
Where's the temp come from?
I was just making it up. All right. Okay. So we're just going
to put it in there, but I'd put something like, given my sync folder is temp.
But we don't have a sync folder yet. So yeah, we would just clone it to the current working directory. How do we use that as an example? The repository is cloned into the current working directory as sync.
Okay, so does that mean you should mention the current working directory in the given?
So given I and I mean, that end seems a bit funny, but in the /temp directory, and I have a directory called git sync. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but now it feels a bit too detailed, doesn't it? Because the temp, the temp location isn't really relevant.
Okay, so
given I have no directory called git sync in the current working directory.
So given I have no directory called git sync and
is it the current working directory? Would a reasonable reader assume we're talking about the current working directory?
I don't know. We don't have a reasonable reader.
A reasonable future person joining the project.
I think we spoke about this last time as well, where I was trying to avoid bringing this up as long as possible, but it runs as a library and it runs as a command line application. And I was trying to keep the...
Is this true for both?
No, the library version of it would require you to configure the clone directory.
So let's take that current working directory concept out.
Okay.
It's not relevant to the rule, and it's narrowing our options. You could have something like, I don't suggest you change this, but you could have something like given, look at the background, given the clone directory is configured to be, and then write everything with that included. But it's a bit of extra stuff. I think if I read this, if I've got no directory called git sync, I'm kind of imagining there's a folder. There's like a target folder.
Is this something we would use like context to set up multiple features or scenarios and say, hey, we're assuming your clone directory is set up as this. This feature isn't available yet, so it's hard coded to use /temp. Like, would we just add that as a bit of blurb somewhere?
Yeah, I wouldn't bother.
No, okay.
Because it's not about that rule. Like maybe when we're writing the stuff about when we're talking about configuration and how syncs map to which folder things get synced to, we probably will want to include all that detail. But for the purpose of this, we don't, because all we're really, what's the rule going to be? It's going to be an if statement that lists some files and then bails out, right? So to understand this rule, I think we've got enough.
Okay, so that means we just move on to rule 2.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you do something else? Okay. So
we're never going to get to perfection as well, are we? And these are living documents. They're going to change over time.
Isn't that why you're here?
as we implement things, and as we implement the tests, as we implement new features, we're going to modify these. Like quite common, I think that quite common that happens is like you don't mention the folder that this is all happening in, like we've done, right? And then later you realize there is a rule that's really specific about which folder it's in, and you have to go and add givens to the other features. But you can't include all of the detail that's needed to execute it in every scenario. So you've got to pick and choose which bits are going to be written here in the Gherkin and which bits are going to be implementation details of the test that I'm going to hard code in the test. And the important thing is, which bits do you think someone should read? Like, to automate it, we're going to have to get the system into the state where it knows which folder it's syncing into, and it knows it's able to list that directory and stuff like that. But is that going to be in the test implementation, or is it going to be visible to human readers? It depends whether it's useful for them to understand the rule.
All right. Okay.
And it depends whether it's important for them, for the rule to be validatable. So all of the detail that you need to understand the rule should be in the scenario.
Okay.
So the bit that's slightly missing for me, but might not be missing for most people, is in that previous one. Is it obvious that it's taking the last part of the folder name, and is that a standard Git behavior? I think it's a standard Git behavior, isn't it?
It is. If you do a git clone XYZ, it's going to create an XYZ directory.
That's fine. And that's
trying to do as much extensible Git defaults as possible.
And that's not a rule of our system, so let's not worry about it.
Right. So our second rule is if the target directory exists and is not a Git repository, then we enter and exit with non-zero code. So the rule is if the target directory, if the target directory exists, this is not a Git repository.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there's a folder at that location that is not a Git repository. Given I have a directory called git sync, that is not a Git repository.
Okay. Our example is this kind of the same one-to-one map, and you said that would happen if we have a rule with a single example. So
yeah, I wonder if we can think of any situation where no. There's not a situation where it would sync into the folder anyway.
Not if it's not a Git repository. Like that's our we don't want to touch that. It's not managed by us. Let's just leave it. It's gone.
You can move your not implemented tag up to the feature if you want to, just for.
So I'll just try and type this up, and then we can review it and see. So I have a directory.
While you're typing, it's worth mentioning that underneath the rule and underneath the example, you can put free text. So between the rule and the example keyword, and between example and given, you can put some paragraphs of explanatory stuff if it's useful. So you can flesh these things out quite a lot. Yeah. So what's the non-CLI specific bit of that, of the then? If you're talking about the library.
Well, I was about to type, then I crash, and I'm like, well.
What does the library do?
It would return an error object or type.
All right. Yeah. So then the repository should not be synced. Not be cloned.
Then it should be cloned. Make sense?
Yeah, and you could put. So here's a user interface thing creeping in. You could put and an error reported or something generic like that. If it's if it's important to the business rule that an error is reported, rather than the error just being a nice thing to do for users. So the distinction there is, did someone who cares about the business say we need to definitely know it didn't work, or is that just a nice thing we're going to do because we're nice to people and print out nice error messages?
Yeah, I think what I want people, like, again, if I try to put on I'm about to consume this library or CLI application as an external user, then what's important for me to get back out of this file would just be that I know that directory is not going to be mutated, modified, blown away.
Yeah.
I don't know if
And
this then covers that enough.
That's a common mistake, right? Is that so? A common feedback thing in bad examples is like people will just put, then I should get an error message, and they won't capture the directory shouldn't have been cloned over. My data should have been preserved. They sort of miss the actual side effect, and they focus on the UI, which is like get an error message.
So should I maybe be a bit more explicit here? And it's not that we don't clone anything; it's that existing directory is left untouched or something.
Yeah, if you think that's important, I'd base it on understanding the business domain, whether that's an important part of the rule.
Then,
like, it might be you've had a history of this application destroying your existing data, and everyone mentions it in every scenario, and all the data should be preserved. But because these are for people, it's always contextual with the audience. Yeah. So the important thing in the given is that the directory called gitsync, which is not a Git repository. So you can either put that in one line, or you can put like a new line and.
Okay.
I'd put either it or gitsync between and is.
The fun one then. It is a directory. It is a Git repository. Multiple examples. So let's see how we get on with this one.
So now we've got a few. If there's a step that is really similar to a previous step and is just like a couple of words different, just use the wording from the original step, or change the previous step. Okay. Just for the automation. If the same thing said two ways and it means something slightly different, even if it's the same underlying step, I wouldn't dedupe there. If you see what I mean. I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay.
But something is wrong. It doesn't match the remote.
So something that's not captured in our Miro board.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, no, we do capture it here. It's just our rule here is like if the directory is Git, it doesn't match the remote, don't clone. But then we actually have an example where we do the clone. So like the rule was probably just, I don't know if it's a rule or what, but this is basically just saying if we have a directory and it's a Git repository, then there's a few things that can happen. Not a rule specifically. Does that mean we got something wrong?
The rule is don't clone it if it's.
But we do here, the origin points to the right URL, so we assume it's the right one, and we start reconciling.
Yeah, often if there's a rule like you can only do X if Y, you'll have an example where you can do it and an example where you can't do it. There'll be a happy and a sad. In this case, we've got two sads and a happy.
Okay, so what does that mean for a rule here? Because that means I probably shouldn't be saying that we don't clone in the rule. So this isn't a rule anymore, is it?
It is, because there's an if at the start. So we don't if X, then we don't Y.
Right, okay.
You can still have an example where we do. You can rephrase it.
I only need this.
Do not clone it. You still need, the rule should be like an algorithm. So you've put if at the start because you're a developer. Some people, I think non-developers often will put the thing first and then say if. But just match what someone said.
So let's, I just want to make sure I get it. I don't know if I'm complaining about semantics, that's not really important, right? But the rule here is if the target directory doesn't exist, and then we have an example of what happens. And then here, we probably shouldn't say that it errors. Instead, we should just say if the target directory exists and it's not a Git repository. And then down here, we're saying, okay, if it does exist, then it is a Git repository. And then we have our examples.
Yeah, but you don't have the rules. If the target directory exists and it's a Git repository, what's the rule?
Well, that's what I was
we
saying
should.
here. There's no rule anymore.
Yeah, it needs to be a rule.
Okay. So if the target directory doesn't exist,
We can clone.
we can clone the repository.
Maybe they're a bit too examply. Hang on. So what is the rule? Maybe we can collapse them a bit.
Oh, okay.
I think I split them out in the example mapping, but so that first one, that first example is the sort of happy path, isn't it? The happiest path.
Yeah. So if there's no local state, then we clone it. We're off. That's it. Reconciliation starts. There's nothing to worry about. So is that not in a rule? Is this just an example of this feature?
Yeah, maybe. Let's take the rule out for a moment. Maybe someone in the chat can suggest what the rule is there. The rule is the rule is it clones it into the right place.
But is that not just an example? Do we need an explicit rule there? I guess I'm back to this. Maybe that's the same kind of question that Wolfgang asked earlier. I'm not sure. When the rules and examples map directly like that, should we not just omit the rule? And then when we have multiple examples, then maybe the rule can be enforced and we structure the scenarios a little bit differently.
Yeah, I've been trying recently not to omit the rule. I wonder if the rule is something, for that first one, it's something like it gets cloned into the right place.
It works. Like, oh, your software can work. I mean, is that a rule? I don't know.
If the repository has not been synced, we create a new folder.
Not sure how I feel about that.
Okay. Is it easier to put the examples first and then we'll group them into rules?
Yeah. Let's do the examples and then see if we can... And then see if our rules reflect what we had in our example.
So the first example, the happy example is, here's what happens when you sync. The second example, I think maybe these two are about if there's something else on disk in a colliding folder name, we don't clone.
All right, let's get the example. Let's see examples then first, and then we'll try and we'll try and reverse engineer the rules. So what we're saying here is the local directory as the wrong Git repository. So we have a .git directory, it has an origin configured, but the URL does not align with what we were expecting. So we have...
Yeah, and I like the example title you've given there, because the detail is going to be in the steps, but we're illustrating a general case.
I'm glad I got something right. So we have a directory called git sync, and it is a Git repository. And
but
it has...
use the word but there. So but is the same as and, but I think it reads better. No, the second one. But
it has a remote called origin that points to a different repository.
Because we're going to name the repository in the when step, why don't you name the repository in this step? Why don't you give the explicit URL?
And it
just
points
for that
to
parity.
Yeah. Git series, so just a different repository, although maybe to similar name. I don't want to cause any confusion. So, all right. So we've got our given and but. Then when I sync and then in fact, let's just copy this. Oh, come on, computer. Repository, then the directory is left untouched and nothing is cloned.
Now they seem the same because they've got the same outcome. So it's like there's something there that isn't a clone of the thing we're trying to clone.
All right, let's get the other two in, and then we'll chase. We'll try and pull that thread a bit more. So we've got the has origin wrong URL, has no origin, right? So this is pretty much going to be. Can you have multiple given when thens per example, or would it be a new example?
There's a new example.
Even though the example title would be the same, is that okay?
Why is it the same?
It's still the wrong Git repository, or should we be more specific here? Sorry.
Yeah, just say doesn't have a remote. Doesn't have an origin remote.
Local directory is local. Local. Ugh. Okay, I'll fix this first. So we have a directory called git sync. It is a Git repository, but it has no remote called origin.
Yeah. So the example is local directory with no origin remote. You don't have the example title isn't mandatory, by the way.
All right. Okay. Would I keep calling this local directory, or would I say local Git repository has no, like, does that make it more correct? So local Git repository has no remote.
Local clone, local checkout.
Yeah, local clone. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Local clone has no remote called.
And then local, let's use clone in the one above.
Yeah, so local clone has incorrect remote for origin and remote incorrect URL for origin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
so I think they group together now, don't they? As a rule. You want to keep going? Let's keep going.
Well, the last one is that it works. The happy path. So do we? I think you're right, and that we've said, okay, these are very, very similar. This is the rule.
It's a different happy path. It's a different happy path, right? It's a happy path where there is a local checkout, and we're going to skip. So it's a different outcome, different context, and a different outcome.
So local clone is the correct, has the correct origin remote. So given, and I'm just going to.
Yeah, so maybe it's not the happy path. It's that we're.
So given I have this directory as a Git repository, and it has a remote.
Is it auto completing from the other thing?
Would this be another and the
depending on your ID, it might.
Is...
Well, if you look at line 34, we've already phrased this a different way. Like that structure is something we can use again to be consistent about how we.
Yeah.
So change the URL to the correct
one. Remote origin points to. Yeah, you're right. So then when I sync this repository, then
you need to change the URL on the dot.
Right. Thank you. Then it clones the repository.
No.
The same one doesn't I used up here. No,
it doesn't.
This.
It doesn't clone the repository.
No. Don't tell me how my software works, right? Okay, you're right. It reconciles. I don't know what that means yet.
Okay, and the but in this one is an and because it's not surprising. So I tend to use but when it's like here's the thing that's gone wrong.
Yeah,
to highlight. There's this, but now let's refactor. Do we need to say it's a Git repository if it has a remote for a reasonable reader?
So for me,
could we skip it?
And maybe this is the mistake I'm making, but this to me is something I implement a step in the code's testy side that says I need to create this. I need to make this a Git repository.
Yeah. But you could always
So
do
you're
that lazily when you're setting up the origin, couldn't you? You know.
Okay, so does that mean first we remove
So decide on readability first.
Local clone called git sync. That's the language we used earlier.
That's nice, isn't it?
Here, have a local clone called git sync.
Is it a clone if it's the wrong one?
Between a directory and a local clone. So,
which kind of makes sense.
I think so.
Git directory.
I like local clone. I think it fits in most of the examples that we have here. It makes sense to me. I know that it's a Git repository. I know that I have an origin. I have a remote, and I can inspect it. So, yeah, I think that language works well.
So just when we got to that last example, it's like, and the system carries on to the next step, to reconciliation, right? Which made me realize we haven't really captured in the previous ones that we bail out. So
correct.
Where we've said nothing is left untouched and nothing is cloned, we need to sort of say we stop, and the clone fails, or whatever you think sounds best that makes it clear that it doesn't then proceed to start reconciling that.
I mean, we don't do anything here except say it's cloned. We don't really mention. So maybe that's not important. Maybe it's just the directory is left untouched. Yeah,
I feel like we need something that captures the fact it's not an exception, is it? But if an error comes back, or at the CLI, exits.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those weird systemy things that I never know how to quite phrase when it comes to these scenarios. Well, I mean, do you have an idea? Are you trying to tease something out of me here, or no? Okay, then.
And an error happened. An error occurs. Something like that. Do a bad. Put something bad in,
and
we'll fix it later. The clone fails. What's this bit called? Bootstrap?
Yeah, there we go.
Bootstrap errors.
Bootstrapping exits. Errors.
Yeah, and then put that in the places that. So it's good to try and take stuff out. Take out the nothing is cloned. Then, what's the then? Nothing is cloned, maybe.
Complete. So we're saying here that there are two states of bootstrapping. Either we're going to complete or we're going to error. That, to me, is a very definitive, hey, I've got some optional return type here.
Yeah, okay. So put that in the other happy path as well. Yeah. And on that last one, let's use the word already in there, just for clarity. So scroll down again. Make you ping around.
Here?
And it already has a remote on the, there. Something like that,
But isn't that what we define with that I have a local clone? You're not unfair from that.
Okay. Yeah, put it in the example title then, maybe. Local clone already has the correct origin remote.
I don't. Can you try and articulate the value of adding already? It's over what we have.
Because no. Okay, leave it out. I'm easy. Okay. So let's see if we can put some rules in. It seems like there's a rule for the second and third ones.
These ones here. The rule is if we have a local
existing local clone has to have the correct
clone, and the remote isn't correct. Is that a rule? No, it's not a rule yet. Then error. Is that a rule?
Yeah, or you could put it like, if we have a local clone, the remote has to be correct.
Oh, okay. Yeah. If we
already have a local clone, then the remote has to be.
The origin remote must be correct.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Means that comes in. Now the indentation here, should this example move above the rule?
So once you start adding rules, the indentation doesn't matter. So if you want that to not be in the rule, you should move it up. But I think maybe it's in the rule.
Okay. Yeah.
These are all about local clones.
Yeah, and this is just the correct clone. You're right. Okay.
And what are the ruleless ones up top?
No local directory and not a Git repository.
So the rule is don't clone if there's a clash with an existing non-Git directory. Something like that.
Do we need a rule for the first two?
You don't have to. They're just sort of useful sometimes, because you've got to remember, if you think it's obvious, you could maybe err on the side of leaving out the example title and putting the rule title in if you wanted to make sure you already have the rule, always have a rule.
I think what is kind of making sense to me is the first two. Well, the first one's what I would expect to happen most of the time. The second one is a very explicit one rule, like, hey, that's a directory, it's not a Git repository. There's no ifs and buts there. And then the third one, I feel it should have a rule because, yeah, there are different forks in that code path. Like, it's like, hey, we actually need to check a whole bunch of things for this rule to be true.
So think about it this way. Think about two different types of rules. Some rules are constraints and things you're not allowed to do. And that's what we've got so far in our rule, is like, you're not allowed to do, here's something that would cause a problem. So we've got two examples of the problem and then the sort of happy version of how we resolve it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another type of rule, which is like an enabling thing. How is the thing actually operating? So that first happy path, what are the rules behind it? Is that we'll clone the remote repository to local disk. If we can. So we could write a rule like that. Those two examples could go in a rule that's like, part of the bootstrapping is we clone the repository. What did we have on the Miro board?
I had an idea there. I'll go to the Miro board in a second. So
Yeah, go on.
What if we, what's the words I'm looking for? I'm failing today. Is our rule too specific here? Is our rule that if something exists on the disk, we won't destroy it? Is that a rule that then captures this one too, rather than this very specific rule about the remote being correct?
Yeah, that's a good rule for those first two, is that we're going to preserve any colliding folders.
So, I'm going to put
again the rules kind of I mean, the things you call a business rule and the things you just write as part of the software depend on the business priorities, don't they? So you're going to write this whole system, and is it a business priority that it doesn't clobber the local data? Maybe it is. You only really find that out in the real conversations with stakeholders.
I think that's what I'm thinking. Is like, the reason I want this documented is I don't ever want to be in a position where someone runs this and we destroy something they have locally. So the rule is, if there's a local directory, we're not going to touch it. We're just going to leave it unless it fits the criteria, which we have here.
Yeah.
Maybe there's
think of the rules like, the rules are kind of like acceptance criteria. These are the things that if we implement them, the business is going to be happy. The business is you in this case. But they're the things that will make the system correct if they're implemented. There's loads of other stuff. There'll be much smaller decisions we have to make about how it operates. But it's like the reason we're writing these in this document is these are the ones that they're at that business tech engagement level where non-tech people have to be able to see what the system does.
Okay.
If a local directory exists with the colliding name, or we err on the side of safety.
If a local directory exists, we must confirm correct configuration or something.
What I heard you say was that it's really important to preserve the existing data. Preserve it and show an error. Or we fail early. One of these things. We don't proceed.
Yeah, I think there's something there. I'm not really sure what, though. Let's put these side by side for a moment. So I think where my head is trying to guide me here is that these can both be articulated as a single rule, with these all being examples of how to proceed. And what the rule I'm trying to explain is like, okay, if we have a local colliding directory, then additional checks must be made before writing, before taking control of before the thing. So
if we have a local existing directory, it must be a correct Git clone. It must already be. But then I would probably try and break it out into more rules. I think your instinct is to collate them more than mine is.
Right. I guess it's not really that important, is it? Like, I guess that's just another thing I've got in my head, right? These are living documents. These can change over time. In fact, the title of this episode was Living Documentation with BDD. So, like, I don't need to get this right now. I just need to have a really good base understanding. And then as I actually start to write the code, I might start to pull out more of those phrases, rules, guidelines, and my understanding improves.
Yeah, and I think the thing we're maybe missing, if you scroll up a bit to the top of the feature,
yep,
someone's reading about Git repository bootstrapping. We maybe need to have a rule there, which is like we clone it to the local disk on first bootstrap if the folder doesn't exist. Maybe that's the rule that encapsulates the first. Like there's some you want to write that down somewhere. We do a Git clone.
Does that need to be said? I mean, the feature is, we're calling it Bootstrap, but the feature is we're going to
your interns joined. Your interns joined the company. You said, read these in order. This is the first thing they're reading.
Wording is hard.
The only reason I'm pushing this in this direction is I want the symmetry of everything being in a rule, but it's okay if we don't. It's not really going to affect anything. Because I have seen people like grepping for rules. So I would err on the side of having the stuff in the rule description and not having an example description.
No?
What's the thing we actually do? We clone the thing. We clone the local repository.
I thought we were trying to be in a position where if there's one rule and one example, then we omit the rule and just go with the example. I thought that was kind of the heuristic we'd adhere to there. But then you were saying, well, you want them all to have a rule. But if the rule and the example are the same, should we not just omit the rule? mean, this is still a rule. It's just codified as an example. That's kind of where my
Yeah, so why not put the rule in?
because they're
It's
the
good
same.
to say, what is this rule for? Just so we've got everything on the rule level, because the rules are the important thing. We're going down a rabbit hole. Let's stop.
Okay.
So we've got.
I'm happy. I'm really happy with this. I think this explains our bootstrapping process, where we either you start in with a clean stateless directory, and we start to clone the things we take under management of git sync into the directory, and there are rules of existing state exists of how we can bring that under git sync management, and we've codified that we need a remote code origin. It has to point to the right directory, otherwise we're going to exit the bootstrap. Like, to me, that seems pretty complete in my understanding.
Yeah, for that bootstrapping, the question is like, what would happen next?
The reconciliation.
But this is a deliverable, right? When you bootstrap a thing, you've got you're guaranteed to either have an error message or have a correct clone.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually retroactively describes the existing behavior.
Yeah,
we do have Rust code here that clones a repository, and there's some authentication I'm going to omit for now, but it does try to open it, so it checks if it exists, and it checks the remote URL, which is hard coded to look for the origin. This is what our code does right now.
Go back to the feature for a minute. There's something we can talk about. So we talked a bit last time about what level of the system you'd test this at. Okay. And you've kind of got a 3-level system. Let's simplify it. You've got Git provided by someone else. You've got your library, and you've got a command line application. And I think we said last time you wouldn't try and basically where you choose to test it, the testing setup you try for your automation is going to constrain where the rule gets implemented. It's one of the reasons I like rules in there. So what's the one rule we've got? Can you make it visible? Scroll up a bit. Yeah. If you have a local clone, the origin remote must be correct. Now, some of these examples might be implemented in Git itself already. Your Git library might error when we try and do some of these things. Like if it already has an origin and you're trying to clone into it, it might say, what the hell are you doing? So if we test your library and Git together, some of it might be implemented already by Git, and some of it might be implemented by your library in sort of pre-checks. And if you're kind of fine either way, then a good place to test this is at the library level, right? Yep. Because that means you're not opening yourself up to the possibility that the rule is implemented in the CLI application. You're guaranteed it's either in your library or it's a native Git thing that you're catching and handling nicely.
Yeah, I think that's where I want most of my testing to happen, not on the CLI itself. The CLI is really just a wrapper around the library functions. So definitely.
Yeah. So just to pause on that conversation for a second, the bit we've just done, we would then share it with the people we've talked to, get feedback, massage it. Now we're at like architecture day. We're going to build it now. And we're talking about where we're going to test it. So this stuff about the origin already existing, we don't care. The way we're designing the tests, we don't care if your library reads the origins, checks it's right, or if your library just tries to do the action and catches an error from Git. We're fine either way. Yeah. So that gives you some freedom to do it. But we'll know for sure that we're not relying on the CLI implementing the rule. It's implemented the library. So that's pretty strong. So I think we should automate all of these tests at the library level. And with Git, real Git. And then we'll have to see how slow and flaky it is.
So it's using libgit. It doesn't shell out to like the get executable, but the get executable is just a wrapper around libgit anyway. So it should be relatively fast, provided. I mean, it is actually going to clone these repositories.
So you might need to look at that and then say, maybe I should change it to local Git repositories on the same box if the network speeds are slow. So I'd look at that as you go.
Yeah.
Now, in another situation, if you maybe had a web app, right, that had a logic layer and some database, I mentioned this because of the audience. That's a different situation, because in that situation, you might not be happy if the stuff is implemented in the database. You may be, but you might not be happy if the key business rules are implemented as database constraints or triggers, because there's this feeling in future you might use a different database. Like, I don't want to move from Oracle to Mongo and then realize all my business rules are in the Oracle.
Yeah.
I want to know they're in that layer. So in that case, you would deliberately test it without the real infrastructure as the first test, the first rigorous test. You test it with a fake database. And then you would know that all the rules are implemented in your core business layer. Whereas you're happy with this being very tied to Git, right?
Yes, I am very happy with it being tied to Git. I think that's the safe
otherwise we'd have
for the next 5 years.
Yeah, there'd be some like abstraction layer of VCS interface,
Yeah, I mean, I could call it commit sync and like abstract it away to work with CVS and SVN for Mercurial or whatever. But really, I'm quite happy to tie this into Git.
So the only concern you need to worry about is performance. So that's the only place we might cheat some things. So I would test all of these at the library level. Now, the first question I have is, if all of these are validated already at the library level, which ones would you then need to rerun through the CLI to be happy the CLI works? Let's look at them from the top and see. Let's imagine they're all validated in the library already. So that first one, what would we be testing if we then also tested it through the CLI?
Nothing.
Well, you're still testing something. You're testing the CLI calls the right function on the library. That's all you're testing, right? That's all you'd be validating, is like your CLI does the right command to the library.
Yeah, I guess.
So that might be one we want to test. So you could put a tag on that one saying we want to test this happy path through the CLI. Yeah. Well, you can be a bit agnostic and say like super important, but UI, because then if you want a web interface as well, maybe we test this one through the web interface as well.
True, I do plan on compiling this to WASM and running it in a browser. So
yeah, so that would test the button on the web page. When I click it, it calls the right thing in the library.
Okay. So
by adding this to the list of things we're going to verify through the full stack, we're getting a bit of confidence about that. Now the second one, what's the interaction between the CLI and the library here? It's the same command. And then
I don't think I follow.
Okay. So I'm talking specifically the boundary between your CLI layer and your library layer. What's the interaction? And I want us to cover enough tests that we've validated all the different interactions without too much duplication.
Okay, so the only difference, if we talk about what changes between running Git sync as a CLI application rather than consuming it as a library in your own code, really, I think the only thing that we would need to test is that the CLI is going to provide configuration.
Yeah, but that's not part of this feature.
Yeah, like I don't think there's anything. The CLI in this case, in the simplest form, is just going to be a mapping to library functions. It's not really going to do anything else. Yeah.
It's just like a remote control for the library, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So all we need to look, which is really common, the UI layer is just going to send some commands to the backend and inspect some return values or handle some errors. So in that first one, we're checking that it sends the right command, tells the library to do something, and we're kind of checking that it's, well, we're not checking yet, but we're assuming it's looking at the return value that says, yes, I've done it.
Yep.
So in the second one, local directory isn't the Git repository. It's the same command, but in this case, there's an error. So maybe we want to check that as well. The CLI handles errors that come from the library.
Okay.
And exits with a non-zero exit code. Right?
Yep.
Are there any examples that do anything different?
No, they are all checking that return value of the library, really.
Yeah.
So would I check this feature as CLI instead?
No, because we don't need to test those other ones with the CLI. So I think from what you've said, if those first two run correctly through the CLI, I believe the others will all behave correctly.
Gotcha. Okay.
Given that we've run them all, if we've validated them all at the library, we only need to test those two through the CLI. And this is a really important pattern because it's the thing in the web world, this is where people test every scenario through the web interface, but really all the web interface does is it calls one service and it shows the value that comes back on the screen. So this kind of thinking about what's different in each case really helps us narrow down the end-to-end tests. But
so by tagging these two as CLI, I'm confirming that the CLI knows how to handle a successful bootstrap and an error bootstrap, like it's calling those two functions and handling the return types. And that's kind of what I want the confidence with that tag, right? If I understand it right.
Yeah, and there isn't anything else that it does. All the other scenarios is it tells it to clone something and it either gets an error message or a success message back. So running those through CLI tests aren't going to be useful. So in your
okay.
Yeah,
it makes sense. I was kind of really confused and lost when you were talking about the CLI tag, and I didn't know where we were going. And then
it's not a magic tag or anything; it's just something you've come up with, right?
It was just that one bit where you said no, we don't need to test those, and that's why. That I realized, like the way that we test the mapping works is by picking one successful, one error, and we know that it's been handled. That completely makes sense to me. That I got it.
Yeah, good. Because an alternative would be to test everything through the CLI, not test everything through the library. That would give you confidence that the library works. You slightly lose some confidence that maybe some of this stuff is implemented in the CLI. Now, because your CLI layer is quite thin, that's maybe not a concern for you, but you can sort of imagine in a more complex app or in a website, people might put all the logic in their controller layer, or they might put all the logic in the JavaScript. So the practice of testing at a lower level first, really comprehensively, at your kind of application interface layer, application service layer, it is really valuable because it guarantees to you that your core model implements the business rules. And that's bulletproof then for any, if I write a web UI that doesn't actually handle the error messages that come back, that's fine. It won't be a good user experience, but the kind of the directory will have been left untouched. So that kind of thinking about where to apply tests really helps constrain your architecture.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So you would run Cucumber once with a world where everything's going through the library.
Never it'll work.
I haven't used this Rust one, so. And then you'd run it again with a different set of automation with just running the ones that are tagged at CLI.
I just want to, I'm going to see if I can just get this to run enough that it tells me it's not implemented. I did try to implement some of these tests, and I'm just going to comment them all out for now.
So world is the shared state between scenarios.
Yeah, so this library has, I could have called that anything I wanted, but it's called world, and then we can configure a new world with an empty state, and then we define the steps using pattern matching, and then attach that to functions. So I'll just comment all out for now, and we should just see, I guess, a list of scenarios unimplemented. The Rust library actually seems really, really good, actually. I've been quite impressed as I've been tinkering with it.
The thing a lot of cucumbers are missing is a way of running the same features at different levels of automation as part of one execution. So Behat has that and has for a while. And there's some talk of bringing it to the rest of Cucumber, but what you tend to have to do is explicitly run Cucumber twice with different config files, different configurations. Which is all right because you've got the kind of fast in-memory stuff and slower end-to-end stuff. Oh.
Yeah, I think my libgit2. That's another problem with dynamically linking, but let's see if that, I might need to add a reinstall flag to that, yeah. I'll try it one more time. And I think, so if we were to say, like, I'll need to fix that. I'll maybe stick it in a container, just remove, remove this weird host stuff completely. So my next steps then would be to implement, well, I've already got the feature, so to connect up the testing for this to make sure it behaves the way that we want, and then we would come back and we would write the scenarios for the reconciliation loop. Yeah,
the sort of TDD way of doing it. Imagine you hadn't written the code. You would, I think you've got a tag that doesn't run the things that aren't implemented. You'd have just the first scenario not implemented, and you just read each step. You'd automate step by step. And that really guides my workflow when I'm working on stuff. You know, the first one, I'd automate the first scenario. It would fail. Let's have a look at the first scenario again. If you pop open the, so I'd automate this first, right? So the first step, I would have something that checks there's no directory called gitsync in the current folder. I do that as a check rather than deleting it if it exists. So I'd set the current working directory to some temp folder. I'd check there's no file there. I'd call the method that doesn't exist yet when I sync the blah 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 repository. And then I'd run Cucumber and it would tell me there's no method in the library called sync, and I'd go and implement it.
I was kind of hoping I'd be able to show that actually. I've blown away the target directory, so I'll give that a minute and we'll see. But yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, I'd basically do TDD until the first scenario passes, and then I'd maybe think about committing and make myself a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I think we discussed this in the last episode a couple of weeks ago as well. It's like just because there's not a lot of business logic here, I am relying heavily on Git. There's not really a lot of unit tests for me to write here. This is an integration project that needs to be tested, I think, in this way.
Yeah, I mean, you could go down this whole route of having value objects for everything. And the testing strategy, this acceptance testing strategy is from your library down. It checks the library does everything. It doesn't have anything to say about the quality of the library.
Yeah,
that's always still up to the professionalism of the developers, because below that acceptance test level, we do get into the arena of developer tests where developers are deciding what tests to write. Mm-hmm. And that's just up to the team. The value of acceptance tests is you do have some testing that is at that like business delivered boundary, and you start moving towards the more you do this kind of example mapping and then writing things down and then automating the tests based on it, the more trust you get, where people trust that the things in the Gherkin document have all been checked automatically. And manual testing and acceptance testing can focus on the things that we forgot to talk about. Stuff around the borders, stuff that you only see when it's real, you know. So you could automate those steps against your library, get it working, and then you could either, oh nice.
Yeah, there we go. That's what I wanted.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is, well, let's do this on the next stream.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I'd get the first scenario passing with the library. I'd then, depending what time of day it is and how I feel, I'd then either hook it into the CLI and get those tests working, or I'd sort of progress through all the other scenarios on the library. But hopefully by the end, I've got all of those things passing in the library. I've got 2 things passing in the CLI. I hit commit. I commit the scenario with the test, with the code. Or, you know, if I write it afterwards, I squash it so it looks like I did it in the right order.
Nice.
And that's my PR.
Yeah, awesome.
Feature done.
Happy with that. That was good.
Good place to end then.
Yeah, I think if we get another one of these scheduled, I'll teach you a little bit of Rust and we'll work to implement some of this together. It'll be really good fun. And then we can hopefully tackle it. Delete all my code.
Yeah, and we can re-TDD it. Now you know how it works in your head.
Right, okay. Yeah, fine.
No, you don't have to.
I'll maybe just comment it all out or put it into backup.rs or something. What I will do is, because we're at a pretty good stage now, is I will commit this and push this. We'll speak afterwards. We'll get something else scheduled where we actually write the test, connect up the steps, really handle that libraries CLI tag and what that looks like. And I think that's pretty awesome. I'm really happy with that.
Cool. Oh, great.
Well, I mean, as always, Kieran, you've got a lot of knowledge, and it's great to be able to extract it from you. And thank you for sharing it with me.
No worries. If anyone watching wants to know more, get in touch.
Yeah, Kieran McNulty on Twitter. Sorry?
I'll come and do it at your company.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Kieran. I'll speak to you afterwards. We'll get something scheduled. If you enjoyed that, drop something in the comments. Let us know if there's anything that you want to see us cover from a BDD scenario. Then obviously we'll try and do something on the next episodes. And of course, reach out to Kieran if he can come and help you with your own domain. He's a wise man. Thanks, all right. Man. Thanks a lot. I'll speak to you again soon. Have a nice day.
See you next time.